Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. We've now had a few days to digest the results of the US election. Donald Trump ended up winning each of the 7 so-called battleground states, the Electoral College, and the popular vote by more than 2 percentage points so far. At FP, we're already turning our attention to what a second Trump term could mean for the world. Trump has announced he will not name some key former officials to top roles, including former CIA Director and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his former UN ambassador and rival Nikki Haley. But among the people he has named, reportedly, are the former police officer Tom Homan as his border czar and New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik as his UN ambassador. So I mentioned some Trump personnel hires, and the reason why we're looking at those closely is that it might give us a clue about his foreign policy priorities in a second term. But beyond the names, there's also a battle of ideas with scholars and policymakers putting out visions for what a conservative policy could or should look like, whether or not the Trump administration will listen to them. My guest today is a former policymaker who has been making the case for what she calls conservative internationalism. Kori Schake has served in the State and Defense Departments as well as the National Security Council. Under several presidents, she's currently at the American Enterprise Institute, and I should point out she's been a fierce critic of both the Biden and Trump administrations. Kori Schake, welcome to FP Live.
It's a great pleasure, my friend.
So I think it might be useful to just begin with an assessment. If you look purely at Trump's first term, not 2.0 and what we imagine things would be like, purely at the first term, how would you characterize his foreign policy?
Well, in the first term, as I expect will be the case in the second term, there will be a very high chaos premium because it's so difficult to predict specific policy choices in a Trump administration. And so even though, as Tom Wright pointed out in 2016, and Elizabeth Saunders has pointed out in recent weeks, the main lines of Trump policy are actually quite predictable, right? He thinks tariffs are a useful bludgeon against friends and enemies alike. He believes allies are a burden on the United States rather than a cost-effective way to limit the costs and risks to the United States. He thinks immigration is overwhelming the United States culturally and economically. Those things are quite predictable elements of his policy. And the second thing I would point out as an indicator for a second term is that in his first term, he actually made a lot of effort to implement what he had campaigned on. And so I think listening to what he said when he was campaigning does give a sense of his priorities. You know, one of the things President Trump, candidate Trump, was extraordinarily successful at in 2016, 2020, and 2024 was using his rallies as a way to test drive public support for his priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And he did keep faith in the first term on immigration limits, and in particular on immigration limits on Muslims and on people coming from war-torn or poor countries. He created an enormous amount of friction with America's allies, calling into question, mostly privately, the NATO Article 5 guarantee, but publicly threatening and attempting to carry out the removal of American forces from Europe, Japan, and South Korea. And in the Japanese and South Korea case, unless the contributions of those governments were tripled to the cost of American operations for common defense.
Kori, I'll just add there, if I may, that, one of the things we all struggle with in interpreting Trump is that sometimes his bark can be worse than his bite. So he says things that are designed to, get other actors to change their behaviors. So threatening to pull out of NATO, for example, he may do that. But, in hindsight, then his advisors and his surrogates often say, oh, he did that to get European countries to up their spending.
So I agree with that judgment. And one of the things that is noticeable is President Trump is privately, I think, saying the same thing right now, which is that by threatening Europeans on American willingness to carry out our alliance obligations, he is leveling the playing field and inducing more from them. And as far as it goes, that's true. But what President Trump and the people advising him do not take into account is the fact that by calling the alliance commitment into question, it also raises uncertainty, which may cause adversaries to test our willingness to carry out our obligations. And it also raises the cost of allies helping us with other policies we're trying to carry out in the world. Because if allies have to focus much more on their own defense, they are much less likely to help us on our biggest priorities, like navigating China's aggression.